Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dallas International Film Festival. My name is Peter Simic. I'm the arts editor for D Magazine, and I'm the editor of FrontRow, which is the sponsor of this stage. And we're here tonight with Je-kyu, the director of My Way, a film that's debuting tonight in Dallas, at least, at the festival. And welcome. Thanks, guys, for coming.
Thank you for having us.
I wanted to start by asking you about the background behind the film because it's a very intriguing story. Apparently it starts with a photograph of two Korean soldiers that was found in Nazi uniforms, and from there the story kind of imagines how they got to that point, to that actual real historic photograph. So where did you discover this photo, and sort of how did the whole story come from there, and how did you unfold it?
그러니까 지금부터 한 6년 전에 그 한국에 있는 인터넷
The photograph was actually part of the U.S. I don't know, national or military archives, and so when it was released on a Korean internet site, it kind of became a big sensation. And so there was a script related to it, which I kind of came across, and I found some interest in it. But there was also a documentary made, just because the story itself is so remarkable. And when I saw that documentary, I really thought this is the film that I want to make.
So is the fiction film movie that you made, does it stay close to what the documentary discovered or what the true life story is, or was there some sort of creative license taken on what actually came to the screen? Or how much could anyone find out about these two characters who had such a remarkable story?
So the original photograph shows, actually it's one man that is in the original photograph, and the documentary actually did a great job of tracking down the truth behind this character. Even though the person himself was not identified, it really did successfully track him from Seoul to the battlefront in Nomonhan, and then to being a POW, and the war between the Germans and the Russians to the Normandy front. So that the journey itself is based on the historical reality, but I think all the elements of the marathon, the relationship, those things were the creative license that I took in writing the movie.
Well, and the other sort of storyline with this film is that it has one of the largest, or the largest, budget in Korean filmmaking history. And that's definitely something that takes center stage in terms of the production value and the excitement of a lot of the battle scenes and things like that. So, I mean, there were lots of ways to take this story from the documentary, take from the photo, and imagine it, but what was the thought behind making it such a, the movie it became, this sort of very exciting, action-driven film?
글쎄요, 그것은 저의 결정이 아니고.
I think just telling the story itself required this level of scale. I mean, the man's journey of, wearing 3 different military uniforms and fighting in 3 major wars, kind of, in order to tell that story, and just to reflect the reality of it, I had to embark on just doing a giant movie.
I think there are probably a number of directorial influences in terms of the style of the film. I think Spielberg is one that a lot of people have been pointing to. Or were there filmmakers or movies that you were thinking about or referencing in some of the ways you put together some of the scenes and the sequences?
글쎄요, 저는 이제
speaking of these, the influences, I must say, actually, a lot of directors, to those whom they admire, they have other directors appear in their films or take certain shots as homage to other works, and I must say that I wish I could do more of that, and because I do really respect these other directors, but I'm so tense in preparing this film and making everything to the story as much as possible that not so much in this case. Maybe going forward, I'll be able to be a little bit more relaxed and have a greater dialogue with other directors.
Well, the tension is, I imagine, would be part of the process because you are dealing with such a large budget, such a large production, a large crew, and I mean, what was that experience like outside of tension? I mean, what was happening there? What was it sort of like on the set, and was there a lot of pressure to kind of get it all done and keep everything moving and kind of steering a large ship, so to speak?
일단 저희 영화
I think the biggest stress of making a movie like this is because of the large numbers of people involved in the special effects and so many things that are going on. Every single day, there were people on staff or whatnot getting injured in some way. And so it was a huge burden. And I would, I'm not a particularly religious person of any sort, but I would start off the day with a prayer that, especially my main actors and, the people who are in front of the camera would not be injured and we could keep making this film. And at the end of the day, I would end it always with a prayer of thanks. And so, everything else is logistics, but people's safety was a paramount concern and a burden to me.
Which kind of makes the movie amazing because you're dealing with this huge production, but at the same time, what really drives it isn't just the special effects and the action sequences, but the core story between the two leads. And how do you, as a director, be able to get that level of intimacy between those two characters while you're also dealing with such sort of bombastic, amazing sequences? How do you keep that balance between what's the story and everything else that is part of this huge production that's what you're dealing with?
네, 아무래도 이제 그 특히 이제 그 얘기
The story itself, the structure of the story is a big story, especially this journey. It's a global journey, so obviously that was something that I had to contend with. But I was really conscious about not losing the finer details. And before I said I started every day with a prayer, and after that I would try to think about what the shots we were taking that day was, and make sure that we weren't losing the human element in this larger story, the larger spectacle that we also had to contend with.
You mentioned earlier that the part of what was sort of created to fill out the story that was behind this photograph was the whole dynamic between the athletes and the runners, and how that sort of ferments their relationship. And where did that idea to kind of set it in sport and to use sport as a way to create that the deepening of the character, but also the strengthening of the bond between the two people?
1930 그때가 1930.
Even that actually takes is a departure from, or the starting point is the reality. The character in the movie of the marathoner who walks in, that's a historical character. In 1936, when Korea was under Japanese rule, a Korean man became the first Asian to win the marathon at the Berlin Olympics in 1936. And so he, in an era where people were not allowed to express themselves or be themselves in a lot of ways, he became the embodiment of hopes and dreams for a lot of Koreans. And so trying to think of how Chun-sik himself would, hold on to his dreams and, have his story. The marathon was a great vehicle for that.
Well, and that touches on, I think, what's interesting from an American perspective is that we're not used to hearing this part of the story of World War II, which is, there's a million stories and a million different perspectives from which it could be told. And Korea's being under Japanese rule and how that all worked out. So how has the film been received in Korea, and what about the film sort of that? What did you want to get across that sort of spoke to what Korea's experience of the war was in the movie?
일단 이 영화를 통해서 표현하고 싶었던.
So the first part is the reason that I wanted to make the film is, especially for Koreans, the closest country that we have, geographically, and our histories are tied up with each other, is Japan. And investigate the nature of what we mean to each other and what do we even understand about each other, because it's been over 70 years since the end of colonial rule, and yet it seems that we're still unable to have a normalized relationship. And how can we reconcile that? So even a single movie is not going to erase that kind of pain, but I thought in order to move forward or to the future, we'd have to have some process of reconciliation, and that was my desire for making this film.
물론 이 한편에 한국 관객들이 과연
So in Korea, the audience reaction, there was a wide spectrum of reactions, and there are certainly, many people that I was gratified who came and told me that they loved the film and they really, enjoyed it. But there's so many people also in Korea who have extremely they have a fixed image of what it means, what Japan is, who the Japanese are, and all of these things. And these feelings and emotions run much deeper and stronger than I had even thought of. And so when they approach the film, it's no longer an objective just experience of the film. They're carrying all their baggage of history and pain with them. And so I think that caused some of the, it made them very uncomfortable. And I think similarly in Japan, we had some people who loved the film and other people who had a very hard time accepting the film because of their own historical perspectives and the different perspectives that they had about Korea as well. So it certainly opened a lot of dialogue on the topic.
You're talking about reactions in Korea and Japan, but when you've brought the film out of Korea and Japan, what kind of reaction has the film had sort of playing to European audiences or even American audiences?
글쎄요, 이게 좀 너무 좋은 얘기 하려니까
Actually, it's a
좀
little
아쉬워지긴
embarrassing for
한데.
me to say, but I mean, the response has been really wonderful, and I
굉장히
think
반응이 좋은 것
other
같아요.
people are not
그러니까
are able to
그런
get
사람들이
past maybe
그러니까
their baggage
이거
about it
뭐
and really
한국과
understand that the
일본의
basic
문제를
message
떠나서
about the film is about the
인간과 인간의
relationship
얘기로
between two human
이제
beings
좀
and
본질적인
finding
그리고
and
영화가
understanding
갖고
each
있는
other
이
no matter
기본적인
despite some
메시지나
very
또 이 영화를
challenging
볼 때 이걸
circumstances.
충분히 즐기는 것 같아요.
So at this point, I don't know if you're there yet in terms of your career, but you have projects in mind that you have coming up or that you want to work on, or coming off a film like this? Do you want to work on something very different, or was the experience such that you want to do something along the same lines in terms of size and scale and that kind of thing?
아마도 전쟁 영화를 연출을
I
하는
will say
사람은
that I think that anybody
비슷한
who's
장르의 영화를
shot
다시
a war
하겠다는
film
생각을 가진
will probably
사람은
walk away
지구상에
from
한
that
명도
experience
없을
thinking,
겁니다.
never
그러니까
again do I want to do that.
사실은
It's not just the
전쟁 영화의 그
logistics, but you're
무거움을
living with the war and the
굉장히 긴
heaviness of the
시간 동안
topic, and I
가슴속에
think that war
담아놓고
itself is
있어야 되기
probably the
때문에
most cruel and
전쟁은
inhumane
정말
thing that we do as human
천직화되잖아요.
beings to each
정말
other in this
이
life.
지구상에서
And so you
아마
carry that with
가장
you in your
소극하고
heart the
가장
entire time you're making the
비인간적이고
film and
비도덕적인
even
film이라고
afterwards,
생각을 하는데요.
and just you
어쨌든
want to
그런
escape to
상황을
something
굉장히
completely
오랜
different.
시간 동안 가슴에 뒀다는 게
Well, that's interesting about I'm curious now about the mood on set, and was it? I was speaking with Isabella Rossellini about making Blue Velvet, and she said even though it's such a violent film, David Lynch tried to make the set very warm and welcome and kind of open and happy, kind of a juxtaposition to what the actual movie was. And I was wondering if those are some things you were thinking about, or was it kind of one of those movies where the production itself was a journey for the whole cast? Was that mood there for the whole crew working through it for all those
그게
weeks and
무거운
months?
거의 영화와 거의 똑같습니다. 그러니까 물론 뭐 그런
I think it's a good. I certainly would like to try to uplift the set like that, but honestly, when you have such a large production on your hands and just not just the film itself, but the schedule and everything is a real challenge, and so we were under a lot of pressure in it. So I don't think I was successful in doing that. And then even beyond that, I mean, just everywhere you look when you're shooting a battle scene, some of them are dummies and some of them are extras, but there's just bodies lying everywhere, bleeding, limbs lost and things like that. And so you're kind of surrounded by the stench of death, and it's a really difficult thing to do. It feels like you're at war.
Well, along those lines, how much of the explosions and all of that was CGI, and how much of that was, you mentioned the danger on the set, so obviously a lot of it was real, but were you concerned about mixing the two, or was there much mixing of CGI and real explosions, real acted out stuff?
대부분의 폭파들은 리얼로 그대로 재현을
In terms of, I mean, there's a lot of other CGI in the film, but the explosions, most of them are real. And that's, I mean, it was something that we, paid a lot of attention to, and everything had to be double checked. Especially when you get to Normandy and you have the bombs falling from the sky, then the scale of those explosions are even larger and more dangerous than any others. So it was a very big obstacle for us.
훨씬 더 그게 하나 더 붙이면은
And just to add to that, Chang Dong-gun, the actor, has worked with me before on a war film, and so he was kind of used to the drill. But Oh Tae-kil had never worked with me and never worked on a war film, and to understand it because these are real explosions taking place, you block them out and you say, A, B, C, D, and you have a very clear path for them to have to run through. And he kind of looked at me like, what do you mean, you want me to do that? It's not the stunt guy. But by the time we got to the Normandy scenes, he was great. He was even better than the stunt people.
Was that important to not use stunt people to have the actors in those scenes? I mean, there's obviously a risk there, but I mean, was that important to have them actually doing it?
물론 스턴트맨이 하고
Using stuntmen and CGI, of course, is always a possibility, but if I had my brothers, then as a director, the shot that I'm thinking about, the light in their eyes that I want to catch, it would be the best possible scenario is for them to be doing the action themselves.
Well, you mentioned wanting to do something very different after this. Are there any specific projects you have in mind, or that you're working on?
예, 근데 있죠. 있고 또
There's a project that I've been working on for a while. There are other projects that are coming in, and having done this for a couple of years, the one thing that I know is that it's not really up to me. So I will see what happens next, but I'm looking forward to working on my next project.
Okay, well, great. Thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it, and congrats on the film. And it debuts in Dallas tonight, the film festival, I believe, here, right? Yeah. So My Way. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
감사합니다.